In 1882, at a school in Pennsylvania, a photographer took a portrait of a Navajo boy named Tom Torlino. He had long hair, traditional clothing, a steady, quiet gaze.
3 years later, the same photographer took the same boy's picture again. Hair cropped, skin paler in the print, wool suit, eyes not quite the same.
The photograph was propaganda. The transformation was the point, and the man who ran the school had a slogan for what he was doing to children like Tom. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Captain Richard Henry Pratt, 1892.
What happened inside the federal Indian boarding school system is not ancient history. The last school in the old model closed within the lifetime of people watching this video. More than 150,000 Indigenous children passed through these institutions. At least 973 never came home. This is that story. Before the United States existed, the project of unmaking Native children had already begun. In 1640, Jesuit missionaries founded St. Mary's, one of the earliest institutions in North America specifically designed to educate Indigenous children in European ways. Spanish and French Catholic orders, and later Protestant denominations across the British colonies, built similar schools. In 1754, an Indian school in Lebanon, Connecticut, grew into what we now call Dartmouth College, an institution whose founding charter promised the education of youth of the Indian tribes. The formula was already recognizable. Separate the child from the family, replace the language, replace the God, reshape the child. What began as scattered missionary work, Jesuit, Moravian, Puritan, would eventually become something the U.S. government chose to scale, to fund, and to enforce. In 1819, Congress passed the Civilization Fund Act. It is one of the most overlooked laws in American history, and one of the most consequential. On its surface, it was a modest appropriation for the education of Native Americans. In practice, it did something extraordinary. It handed federal money to Christian missionary societies and asked them, in the language of the law, to civilize Indigenous nations. Federal tax dollars, funding the religious conversion of Native children. A direct federal religious partnership that continued for more than a century. Here is what most Americans are never taught. The goal was land. If Native nations could be persuaded or compelled to abandon collective stewardship of territory in favor of individual Western-style property ownership, the unused communal land could be declared surplus, surveyed, sold, settled. Education, in the American sense, became an instrument of dispossession. The schoolhouse and the land office were, from the beginning, two hands of the same policy. To understand what boarding schools would become, you have to understand a prison in Florida. Between 1875 and 1878, a U.S. Army captain named Richard Henry Pratt was assigned to oversee 72 Indigenous prisoners of war at Fort Marion in St. Augustine. They were Cheyenne, Kiowa, Comanche, Arapaho, and Caddo men, leaders and warriors captured during the Indian Wars of the Great Plains. Pratt conducted an experiment on them. He cut their hair. He put them in military uniforms. He drilled them. He taught them English. He organized them into a guard system where Indigenous men were forced to monitor and discipline one another. He called his method reform through total immersion. And when he believed he had succeeded with grown warriors, he began to argue something more ambitious. If you could do this to captured adults, imagine what you could accomplish with their children. In 1879, the Department of the Interior granted Pratt an abandoned Army barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It would become the first federally run, off-reservation boarding school, and the blueprint for more than 400 others. Pratt's governing philosophy, delivered in an 1892 address, became the mission statement for the entire system. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. By 1918, more than 7,800 children from 140 different tribes had passed through Carlisle's gates. Here is something most people do not know. Some of Carlisle's first students were drawn deliberately from the families of tribal leaders. They were, in effect, hostages, guarantees of tribal compliance with federal policy. If the father signed the treaty, the child might come home. This was not a secret at the time. It was a design feature. When a child arrived at Carlisle, or Haskell, or Chamawa, or Chilocco, the intake process was nearly identical. It was designed to be. The hair was cut first. For many indigenous nations, long hair carried deep spiritual meaning. For boys in several Plains traditions, it marked the approach of manhood. In some cultures, cutting one's hair was an act reserved for mourning. The schools knew this. They cut it anyway. Then came the name. Children were forbidden to use their tribal names and were issued English ones, often drawn from lists of saints, biblical figures, or American presidents. A Lakota name that encoded family lineage and spiritual identity could be replaced, on a line of paperwork, with John or Mary. Then the language. Children were beaten for speaking Lakota, Dene, Muskogee, Ojibwe, even in whispered conversation with their own siblings. The punishment was the point. Strip a child of the language their grandmother speaks, and you have severed them from their grandmother. That was the intention. It was written down. Then the clothes, often burned on arrival. Then the church, whether the child's parents consented or not. And then the schedule, every hour of every day governed by a bell. Name replaced. Language forbidden. Hair cut. Clothing destroyed. Religion reassigned. Family contact severed. Most Americans, when they learn about boarding schools, imagine a handful of institutions. The real number is staggering. The Department of the Interior's investigation, released in 2 volumes between 2022 and 2024, identified 417 federal Indian boarding schools operated or supported by the United States across 37 states and territories between 1819 and 1969. Approximately half received direct support from religious institutions: Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopal, Quaker, Mennonite. Under President Grant's so-called peace policy of 1869, Christian denominations were literally assigned specific reservations to Christianize, using federal tax dollars to do it. Tribal leaders today describe the Federal Religious School Partnership as one of the longest-running violations of the Establishment Clause in American history. The federal government spent more than $23.3 billion in today's dollars on boarding schools and related assimilation policies between 1871 and 1969. And here is the detail that belongs in every textbook and is in almost none of them. Much of that money did not come from the general treasury. It came from tribal trust accounts, funds held by the U.S. government on behalf of tribal nations, derived from the forced cession of more than 1 billion acres of indigenous land. Native nations were made to pay, with their own stolen land, for the institutions that took their children. Inside the schools, life was labor. The curriculum was split, half rudimentary academics, half what administrators called industrial training. Boys learned blacksmithing, carpentry, farming. Girls were assigned laundry, cooking, sewing. The 1928 Meriam report, a landmark federal study, eventually exposed what was already obvious. This labor was not training. It was how the schools kept the lights on. Federal funding was chronically insufficient, so children, some as young as 10, were required to perform 4 hours of what the government itself called non-educational routine labor every single day. Heavy agricultural work, industrial cleaning, the actual running of the institution. The Meriam report found that children were fed on as little as 11 cents of food per day. Tuberculosis, typhoid, influenza, measles, and trachoma moved through overcrowded dormitories the way fire moves through a dry field. At Carlisle alone, at least 186 children are buried in the school cemetery. Many died of disease. Some died of what records euphemistically called homesickness. Children who stopped eating, stopped speaking, and did not recover. Many families were never told. Children were buried without their traditions, without their ancestral names, and in many cases, without markers at all. When Carlisle closed in 1918 and the Army later moved the remains in 1927, much of that reburial was done without organization and without notifying the families. The Department of the Interior has now confirmed at least 973 child deaths across 65 school locations, at 74 marked and unmarked burial sites. Researchers believe the true number is considerably higher. It may never be known. One feature of the Carlisle model deserves its own moment, because it is almost never discussed. Pratt called it the outing system. During the summer months, students were placed in the homes of white families to live and to work. Pratt framed it as cultural immersion. In practice, it functioned as a labor pipeline. White farms and households got cheap domestic help. Indigenous children performed the work. When they were paid at all, their wages were typically held by the school, not given to them. Children were sent into homes that regarded them as servants. Some were abused there. Many never saw the money they had earned. It was trafficking, dressed in the language of education. It is a mistake and a disservice to tell this story as if Native peoples only received it. They resisted, constantly, at real cost. Parents hid their children when federal agents came for them. They refused to sign enrollment papers. In 1900, Ojibwe communities threatened armed resistance against the construction of a government school on their land. Federal officials responded by withholding food rations, and in some cases, imprisoning parents until children were surrendered to meet enrollment quotas. Inside the schools, children spoke their languages in whispers after lights out. They held ceremonies in secret. They ran away, sometimes across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar country. Some deliberately broke enough rules to get expelled and sent home. And many took the very literacy they were forced to learn and turned it into a weapon, becoming the lawyers, writers, editors, and advocates who would argue, for the next 100 years, for tribal sovereignty in American courts. The system intended to erase Indigenous identity. Indigenous people intended to survive. Only one of those intentions succeeded. In 1928, a report prepared by the Institute for Government Research, later known as the Meriam Report, laid out in plain government prose what survivors had been saying for decades. Conditions were, in the report's own words, grossly inadequate. Children were starving. The policy itself, the report argued, was fundamentally wrong. Children, it said, belonged in the natural setting of home and family life. The Meriam Report helped pave the way for the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which for the first time allowed the teaching of Indigenous history and culture in federal schools. It was not enough. 41 years later, in 1969, a U.S. Senate subcommittee, chaired first by Robert Kennedy, and after his assassination by his brother Edward, released a report with a title that said everything. Indian Education, a National Tragedy, a National Challenge. U.S. Senate, 1969. It was 1969. The system was still operating, and the federal government was still calling its own policy a national disgrace. In 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, Public Law 93-638, a law that, for the first time in American history, allowed tribal nations to run their own federally funded schools. The shift was seismic. Languages that had been beaten out of children were brought back into classrooms, often taught by elders who had kept them hidden for 60 years. Tribal colleges were founded. The remaining off-reservation boarding schools, where they survived, were redefined from instruments of erasure into institutions of cultural restoration. Most of the old schools closed. The last federally operated institution in the original model closed in the early 21st century. The children who survived came home carrying something researchers now call intergenerational trauma. Many had grown up without being parented. They did not know how to parent. Many had been subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and absent any other model of family life, some replicated what they had lived through.
The statistics are not abstractions.
Adults with a parent who attended a federal Indian boarding school are 12 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general population. Rates of depression, complex PTSD, and substance use disorder are substantially elevated across descendant communities. And emerging research is finding something more troubling still. The stress of the boarding school experience appears to have produced epigenetic changes, alterations in how genes related to the body's stress response are expressed, that can be passed from parent to child to grandchild. The trauma was designed to be generational. The science is beginning to confirm that in a biological sense, it was. In 2021, the 54th Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, a citizen of the Laguna Pueblo and the first Native American ever to hold a cabinet position, announced the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. It was the first comprehensive federal investigation into a system the federal government itself had built. Her investigators confirmed 417 schools, 973 child deaths, 127 treaties implicated in the operation of the system, burial sites no one had counted, testimonies from survivors now in their 80s and 90s. On October 25, 2024, President Joseph Biden issued the first formal federal apology for the boarding school system in the history of the United States. He called the government's role a sin. 2 months later, the Carlisle Federal Indian Boarding School was designated a national monument. And at Carlisle, a fight continues. Tribal nations, including the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska and the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, are suing the U.S. Army under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to bring their children home. The Army has so far refused to accept that NAGPRA applies to these remains. Families are being asked to prove, more than a century later, that a dead child was their relative. The litigation is ongoing. It is tempting, when a story is this heavy, to end it in grief. Survivors and their descendants have asked consistently that we not do that. What happened in these schools was the work of a specific policy, passed by specific lawmakers, carried out by specific people, for specific reasons. It was not inevitable, and it was not complete. Children hid their languages under their tongues and carried them home. Grandmothers, who had been forbidden to teach their grandchildren their own names, became the ones who restored them. The institutions built to end Indigenous America are now closed, or transformed, or in ruins. The nations they were built to dissolve are still here. The schools were meant to be the end of a story. They were not. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and leaving a like. I'll see you in the next one.